All it takes is one stray thought or one reaction to some event in the external world to activate that program, and you start feeling the emotion of your past grief. The trigger could be seeing a dog that looks like yours, or visiting a place you once took him as a puppy. Regardless of the sensory input, it activates an emotion. Those emotional triggers can be obvious or subtle, but they all affect you at a subconscious level. And before you can process what has happened, you're back in that emotional, chemical state of grief, anger, and sadness. Once that happens, the body runs the mind. You can use your conscious mind to try to get out of that emotional state, but invariably you feel like you're out of control. Think of Pavlov and his dogs. In the 1890s, the young Russian scientist strapped a few dogs to a table, rang a bell, and then fed the canines a hearty meal. Over time, after repeatedly exposing the dogs to the same stimulus, he simply rang the bell, and the dogs automatically salivated in anticipation. This is called a conditioned response, and the process occurs automatically. Why? Because the body begins to respond autonomically. Think of your autonomic nervous system. The cascade of chemical reactions that is triggered within moments changes the body physiologically, and it happens quite subconsciously, with little or no conscious effort. This is one of the reasons why it's so hard to change. The conscious mind may be in the present, but the subconscious body mind is living in the past. If we begin to expect a predictable future event to occur in reference to a memory of the past, we are just like those canines. One experience of a particular person or thing at a specific time and place from the past automatically or autonomically causes us to respond physiologically. Once we break the emotional addictions rooted in our past, there will no longer be any pull to cause us to return to the same automatic programs of the old self. It begins to make sense that although we think or believe we're living in the present, there is a good possibility that our bodies are in the past. Unfortunately for most of us, because the brain always works by repetition and association, it doesn't take a major trauma to produce the effects of the body becoming the mind. The most minor triggers can produce emotional responses that feel as though they are beyond our control. For instance, you're driving to work and you stop at your usual coffee shop, which is all out of your favorite hazelnut coffee. Disappointed, you grumble to yourself why a major enterprise like this one can't keep in stock such a very popular flavor. At work, you're irritated to see another car in your preferred parking spot. Stepping into an empty elevator, you're exasperated to discover that someone ahead of you pushed all the buttons. When you finally walk into the office, someone comments, "What's up? You seem kinda down." You tell your story and the person sympathizes. You sum it up. "I'm in a bad mood. I'll get over it." The thing is, you don't. A mood is a chemical state of being, generally short-term, that is an expression of a prolonged emotional reaction. Something in your environment, in this case the failure of your barista to meet your needs, followed by a few other minor annoyances, sets off an emotional response. The chemicals of that emotion don't get used up instantly, so their effect lingers for a while. I call that the refractory period, the time after their initial release until the effect diminishes. The longer the refractory period, obviously, the longer you experience those feelings. When the chemical refractory period of an emotional reaction lasts for hours to days, that's a mood. What happens when that recently triggered mood lingers? You've been in a bit of a funk since that day, and now you look around the room during a staff meeting, and all you can think of is that this person's tie is hideous, and the nasally tone of your boss is worse than nails on a chalkboard. At this point, you're not just in a mood, you're reflecting a temperament, a tendency towards the habitual expression of an emotion through certain behaviors. A temperament is an emotional reaction with a refractory period that lasts from weeks to months. Eventually, if you keep the refractory period of an emotion going for months and years, that tendency turns into a personality trait. At that point, others will describe you as bitter or resentful or angry or judgmental. Our personality traits, then, are frequently based on our past emotions. Most of the time, personality, how we think, act, and feel, is anchored in the past. So to change our personalities, we have to change the emotions that we memorize. We have to move out of the past. Refer figure 4b. Create different states of being. There is yet another way that we get stuck and keep ourselves from changing. We may also train the body to be the mind in order to live in a predictable future based on the memory of a known past. And thus, we miss the precious now moment again. As you know, we can condition the body to live in the future. Of course, that can be a means to change our lives for the better when we make a conscious choice to focus on a desired new experience, as my daughter did when she created her summer job in Italy. As her story demonstrates, if we focus on an intended future event, and then plan how we will prepare or behave, there will be a moment when we are so clear and focused on that possible future that the thoughts we are thinking will begin to become the experience itself. Once the thought becomes the experience, its end product is an emotion. When we begin to experience the emotion of that event ahead of its possible occurrence, the body, as the unconscious mind, begins to respond as though the event is actually unfolding. On the other hand, what happens if we begin to anticipate some unwanted future experience, or even obsess about a worst-case scenario based on a memory from our past? We are still programming the body to experience a future event before it occurs. Now the body is no longer in the moment or in the past, it's living in the future, but a future based on some construct of the past. When this occurs, the body does not know the difference between the actual event transpiring in reality and what we are entertaining mentally. Because we are priming it to be juiced up for whatever we think might be coming, the body begins to get ready, and in a very real way, the body is in the event. Here's an example of living in the future based on the past. Imagine that you've been asked to give a lecture in front of 350 people, but you fear being on stage based on memories of previous public speaking disasters from your distant past. Whenever you think about the coming talk, you envision yourself standing there stammering and losing your train of thought. Your body begins to respond as if the future event is unfolding now. Your shoulders tense, your heart races, and you perspire heavily. As you anticipate that dreaded day, you cause your body to already be living in that stressful reality. Caught up in and obsessed by the possibility of failing again, you are so intent on that expected reality that you can't concentrate on anything else. Your mind and body are polarized, moving from the past to the future and back again. As a result, you deny yourself the novelty of a wonderful future outcome. As a more universal example of living in a predictable future, let's say that for many years you wake up each new day only to slide automatically into the same old set of unconscious actions. The body is so used to anticipating performing your daily behaviors that it goes almost mechanically from one task to the next. As feeding the dog, brushing your teeth, putting on your clothes, making tea, taking the garbage out, getting the mail. You get the idea. Although you may wake up with a thought to do something different, somehow you find yourself doing those same old things, as if you were just along for the ride. After you've memorized these types of actions for a decade or two, your body has been trained to continuously look forward to doing these things. In fact, it's been subconsciously programmed to live in the future and thus allow you to go to sleep behind the wheel. We could even say that you're no longer even driving the car. Now your body cannot exist in the present moment. It is primed to control you by running a host of unconscious programs while you sit back and allow it to head towards some humdrum, known destiny. Overcoming your nearly automatic habits and no longer anticipating the future requires the ability to live greater than time. More on that to come. Here's another example that demonstrates how familiar emotions create a corresponding future. You are invited to a co-worker's 4th of July barbecue. Everyone from your department is expected to attend. You don't like the host. He's always number one, and he doesn't mind letting everyone know it. Every time he's hosted an event before, you've wound up having a miserable time, with this guy pushing every single one of your buttons. As you're driving to his place now, all you can think about is how at the last party he interrupted everyone's meal so he could present his wife with a new BMW. You're certain, as you told your partner the whole week leading up to this cookout, that this is going to be one miserable day. And it becomes exactly that. You run a stop sign and get a ticket. One of your co-workers spills a beer on your pants and shirt. The hamburger that you requested be done medium well comes to you barely beyond raw. Given your attitude, your state of being, going in, how could you have expected things to turn out any other way? You woke up anticipating that this day was slated to be a horror show, and it turned out that way. You alternated between obsessing about an unwanted future, anticipating what would come next, and living in the past, comparing stimuli you were receiving to what you received previously. So, you created more of the same. If you start keeping track of your thoughts and write them down, you'll find that most of the time you're either thinking ahead or looking back. So here's another of those big questions. If you know that by staying present and severing or pruning your connections with the past, you can have access to all the possible outcomes in the quantum field, why would you choose to live in the past and keep creating the same future for yourself? Why wouldn't you do what is already in your power to do? To mentally alter the physical makeup of your brain and body so that you can be changed ahead of any actual desired experience. Why wouldn't you opt for living in the future of your choice, now, ahead of time? Instead of obsessing about some traumatic or stressful event that you fear is in your future based on your experience of the past, obsess about a new, desired experience that you haven't yet embraced emotionally. Allow yourself to live in that potential new future now, to the extent that your body begins to accept or believe that you're experiencing the elevated motions of that new future outcome in the present moment. And you're going to learn how to do this. Remember when I said that my daughter needed to live her present life like she'd already had the experiences of the great summer in Italy. By doing that, she was broadcasting into the quantum field that the event had already physically occurred. The greatest people in the world have demonstrated this. Thousands of so-called ordinary people have done it. And you can as well. You have all of the neurological machinery to transcend time, to make this a skill. What some might call miracles, I describe as cases of individuals working toward changing their state of being so that their bodies and minds are no longer merely a record of their past, but become active partners taking steps to a new and better future. At this point, you understand that the main obstacle to breaking the habit of being yourself is thinking and feeling equal to your environment, your body, and time. Obviously, then, learning to think and feel, be, greater than the big three is your first goal as you prepare for the meditation process that you will learn in this book. I'd bet that at some point in your life, perhaps even frequently, you've already been able to think greater than your environment, your body, and time. These moments when you transcend the big three are what some people call being in the flow. There are a number of ways to describe what happens when our surroundings, our bodies, and our sense of time's passage disappear, and we are lost to the world. In speaking to groups across the globe, I've asked audience members to describe creative moments when they were so consumed by what they were doing, or were so relaxed and at ease that they seemed to enter an altered state of consciousness. These experiences generally fall into two categories. The first of these are the so-called peak experiences, what we think of as transcendent moments, when we attain a state of being that we associate with monks and mystics. Compared to those highly spiritual events, the others may be more mundane, ordinary, and prosaic, but that doesn't mean that they are any less important. These ordinary moments happen to me many times, although not as often as I would like, while in the process of writing this book. When I first sit down to write, I often have many other things on my mind. My busy travel schedule, my patients, my kids, my staff, how hungry, sleepy, happy I am. On good days when the words seem to flow out of me, it's as though my hands and my keyboard are an extension of my mind. I'm not consciously aware of my fingers moving or my back resting against the chair. The trees swaying in the breeze outside my office disappear. That bit of stiffness in my neck no longer nudges for my attention, and I'm completely focused on and absorbed by the words on my computer screen. At some point, I realize that an hour or more has gone by in what seemed like an instant. This kind of thing has likely happened to you, perhaps while you were driving, watching a movie, enjoying a dinner with good company, reading, knitting, practicing piano, or simply sitting in a quiet spot in nature. I don't know about you, but I often feel amazingly refreshed after experiencing one of those moments when my environment, my body, and time seem to disappear. That don't always happen when I'm writing, but after completing my second book, I find that they occur with greater frequency. With practice, I've been able to take control so that these experiences of being in the flow are not as accidental or serendipitous as they were at first. Overcoming the big three to facilitate the occurrence of such moments is essential for losing your mind and creating a new one. Chapter 5: Survival versus Creation. In the last chapter, I purposely used the example of my writing to illustrate my point about transcending the big three. Because when you write, you are creating words, whether on the physical page or in a digital document. The same creativity is operating when you paint, play a musical instrument, turn wood on a lathe, or engage in any other activity that has the effect of breaking the bonds that the big three hold over you. Why is it so hard to live in these creative moments? If we focus on an unwanted past or a dreaded future, that means we live mostly in stress, in survival mode. Whether we're obsessing over our health, the survival of the body, paying our mortgage, the survival need for shelter from our external environment, or having enough time to do what we need to do to survive, most of us are much more familiar with the addictive state of mind we'll call survival than we are with living as creators. In my first book, I went into great detail about the difference between living in survival versus living in creation. So for a fuller explanation of this difference, you may want to read chapters 8 through 11 in Evolve Your Brain. In the pages that follow, I'm going to briefly outline the difference between the two. Think of life in survival mode by picturing an animal such as a deer contentedly grazing in the forest. Let's assume that it is in homeostasis, in perfect balance. But if it perceives some danger in the outside world, say a predator, its fight or flight nervous system gets turned on. This sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system, which maintains the body's automatic functions, such as digestion, temperature regulation, blood sugar levels, and the like. To prepare the animal to deal with the emergency it has detected, the body is chemically altered. The sympathetic nervous system automatically activates the adrenal glands to mobilize enormous amounts of energy. If the deer is chased by a pack of coyotes, it utilizes that energy to flee. If it is nimble enough to get away unharmed, then perhaps after 15 to 20 minutes, when the threat is no longer present, the animal resumes grazing, its internal balance restored. We humans have the same system in place. When we perceive danger, our sympathetic nervous system is turned on. Energy is mobilized, and so on, in much the same way as the deer. During early human history, this wonderfully adaptive response helped us to confront threats from predators and other risks to our survival. Those animal qualities served us well for our evolution as a species. Unfortunately, there are several differences between Homo sapiens and our planetary cohabitants in the animal kingdom that don't serve us well. Every time we knock the body out of chemical balance, that's called stress. The stress response is how the body innately responds when it's knocked out of balance, and what it does to return back to equilibrium. Whether we see a lion in the Serengeti, bump into our not-so-friendly ex at the grocery store, or freak out in freeway traffic because we're late for a meeting, we turn on the stress response because we are reacting to our external environment. Unlike animals, we have the ability to turn on the fight or flight response by thought alone. And that thought doesn't have to be about anything in our present circumstances. We can turn on that response in anticipation of some future event. Even more disadvantageous, we can produce the same stress response by revisiting an unhappy memory that is stitched into the fabric of our gray matter. So either we anticipate stress response producing experiences, or we recollect them. Our bodies are either existing in the future or in the past. To our detriment, we turn short-term stressful situations into long-term ones. On the other hand, as far as we can tell, animals don't have the ability, or should I say disability, to turn on the stress response so frequently and so easily that they can't turn it off. That deer, back to happily grazing, isn't consumed with thoughts about what just happened a few minutes ago, let alone the time a coyote chased it 2 months ago. This kind of repetitive stress is harmful to us because no organism was designed with a mechanism to deal with negative effects on the body when the stress response is turned on with great frequency and for long duration. In other words, no creature can avoid the consequences of living in long-term emergency situations. When we turn on the stress response and can't turn it off, we're headed for some type of breakdown in the body. Let's say you keep turning on the fight or flight system due to some threatening circumstance in your life, real or imagined. As your racing heart pumps enormous amounts of blood to your extremities, and your body is knocked out of homeostasis, you're becoming prepared by the nervous system to run or fight. But let's face it, You can't flee to the Bahamas, nor can you throttle your fellow employee. That would be primitive. So as a consequence, you condition your heart to race all the time, and you may be headed for high blood pressure, arrhythmias, and so on. And what's in store when you keep mobilizing all that energy for some emergency situation? If you're putting the bulk of your energy towards some issue in your external environment, there'll be little left for your body's internal environment. Your immune system, which monitors your inner world, can't keep up with the lack of energy for growth and repair. Therefore, you get sick, whether it be from a cold, cancer, or rheumatoid arthritis. All are immune-mediated conditions. When you think about it, the real difference between animals and ourselves is that although we both experience stress, humans re-experience and pre-experience traumatic situations. What is so harmful about having our stress response triggered by pressures from the past, present, and future? When we get knocked out of chemical balance so often, eventually that out of balance state becomes the norm. As a result, we are destined to live our genetic destiny, and in most cases, that means suffering from some illness. The reason is clear. The domino effect from the cascade of hormones and other chemicals we release in response to stress can dysregulate some of our genes, and that may create disease. In other words, repeated stress pushes the genetic buttons that cause us to begin to head towards our genetic destiny. So what was once very adaptive behavior and a beneficial biochemical response, fight or flight, has become a highly maladaptive and harmful set of circumstances. For instance, when a lion was chasing your ancestors, the stress response was doing what it was designed to do: protect them from their outer environment. That's adaptive. But if for days on end you fret about your promotion, over-focus on your presentation to upper management, or worry about your mother being in the hospital, These situations create the same chemicals as though you were being chased by a lion. Now that's maladaptive. You're staying too long in emergency mode. Fight or flight is using up the energy your internal environment needs. Your body is stealing this vital energy from your immune, digestive, and endocrine systems, among others, and directing it to the muscles that you'd use to fight a predator or run from danger. But in your situation, that's only working against you. From a psychological perspective, overproduction of stress hormones creates the human emotions of anger, fear, envy, and hatred. Incites feelings of aggression, frustration, anxiety, and insecurity, and causes us to experience pain, suffering, sadness, hopelessness, and depression. Most people spend the majority of their time preoccupied with negative thoughts and feelings. Is it likely that most of the things that are happening in our present circumstances are negative? Obviously not. Negativity runs so high because we are either living in anticipation of stress or re-experiencing it through a memory. So most of our thoughts and feelings are driven by those strong hormones of stress and survival. When our stress response is triggered, we focus on three things, and they are of highest importance. 1. The body. It must be taken care of. 2. The environment. Where can I go to escape this threat? 3. Time. How much of it do I have to use in order to evade this threat? Living in survival is the reason why we human beings are so dominated by the big three. The stress response and the hormones that it triggers force us to focus on and obsess about the body, the environment, and time. As a result, we begin to define our self within the confines of the physical realm. We become less spiritual, less conscious, less aware, and less mindful. Put another way, we grow to be materialists. That is, habitually consumed by thoughts of things in the external environment. Our identity becomes wrapped up in our bodies. We're absorbed by the outer world because that is what those chemicals force us to pay attention to. Things we own, people we know, places we have to go, problems we face, hairstyles we dislike, our body parts, our weight, our looks in comparison to others, how much time we have or don't have. You get the picture. And we remember who we are based primarily on what we know and the things we do. Living in survival causes us to focus on the 0.0001% instead of the 99.99999% of reality. Most of us embrace the traditional notion of ourselves as a somebody. But who we are has nothing to do with the big three. Who we are is consciousness connected to a quantum field of intelligence. When we become this somebody, this materialistic physical self living in survival, we forget who we truly are. We become disconnected and feel separate from the universal field of intelligence. The more we live impacted by stress hormones, the more their chemical rush becomes our identity. If we fancy ourselves solely physical beings, we limit ourselves to perceiving only with our physical senses. The more we use our senses to define our reality, the more we allow our senses to determine our reality. We slip into that Newtonian mode of thinking, which locks us into trying to predict the future based on some past experience. If you recall, the Newtonian model of reality is all about predicting an outcome. Now we are trying to control our reality instead of surrendering to something greater. All we're doing is trying to survive. If the quantum model of reality ultimately defines everything as energy, why do we experience ourselves more as physical beings than as beings of energy? We could say that the survival-orientated emotions are energy in motion, are lower frequency or lower energy emotions. They vibrate at a slower wavelength and therefore ground us into being physical. We become denser, heavier, and more corporeal because that energy causes us to vibrate more slowly. The body quite literally becomes composed of more mass and less energy. More matter, less mind. Refer to Figure 5A, Survival Emotions versus Elevated Emotions. So it might make sense that if we inhibit our more primitive survival emotions and begin to break our addiction to them, our energy will be higher in frequency and less likely to root us to the body. In a way, we can liberate energy from the body when the body has become the mind into the quantum field. As our emotions become more elevated, we will naturally ascend to a higher level of consciousness, closer to Source, and feel more connected to universal intelligence. When the stress response is turned on, whether in response to a real or conjured up threat, a powerful cascade of chemicals rushes into our system and gives us a strong jolt of energy, momentarily waking up our bodies and certain parts of the brain to put all of our attention on the big three. This is very addictive to us because it's like drinking a triple espresso. We get turned on for a few moments. In time, we unconsciously become addicted to our problems, our unfavorable circumstances, our unhealthy relationships. We keep these situations in our lives to feed our addiction to survival-orientated emotions, so that we can remember who we think we are as a somebody. We just love the rush of energy we get from our troubles. Moreover, we also associate this emotional high with every person, thing, place, and experience in our outer world that is known and familiar. We become addicted addicted to these elements in our environment as well. We embrace our environment as our identity. If you agree that we can turn on the stress response just by thinking, then it stands to reason that we can get the same rush of addictive stress chemicals as if we were being chased by a predator. As a consequence, we become addicted to our very thoughts. They begin to give us an unconscious adrenaline high, and we find it very hard to think differently, to think greater than how we feel, or to think outside of the proverbial box becomes just too uncomfortable. The moment we begin to deny ourselves the substance we're addicted to, in this case the familiar thoughts and feelings associated with our emotional addiction, there are cravings, withdrawal pains, and a host of inner sub-vocalizations urging us not to change. And so we remain chained to our familiar reality. Thus our thoughts and feelings, which are predominantly self-limiting, hook us back to all the problems, conditions, stresses, and bad choices that produce the fight or flight effect in the first place. We keep all these negative stimuli around us so that we can produce the stress response, because that addiction reinforces the idea of who we are, only serving to reaffirm our own personal identity. Simply put, most of us are addicted to the problems and conditions of our lives that produce stress. No matter whether we're in a bad job or a bad relationship, we hold our troubles close to us, because they help reinforce who we are as a somebody. They feed our addictions to lower frequency emotions. Most harmful of all, we live in fear that if those problems were taken away, we wouldn't know what to think, how to feel, and we wouldn't get to experience the rush of energy that causes us to remember who we are. For most of us, God forbid we not be a somebody. How awful would it be to be a nobody, to not have an identity? As you can see, what we identify as ourself exists within the context of our collective emotional association with our thoughts and feelings, our problems and all those elements of the big three. Is it any wonder that people find it so hard to go within and leave this self-produced reality behind? How would we know who we are if it weren't for our environment, our bodies and time? That's why we are so dependent upon the external world. We limit ourselves to using our senses to define and cultivate emotions, so that we can receive the physiological feedback that reaffirms our own personal addictions. We do all this to feel human. When our survival response is way out of proportion to what is happening in our outer world, that excess of stress response hormones causes us to become fixated within the parameters of self. So we become overly selfish. We obsess about our bodies or a particular aspect of our environment, and we live enslaved to time. We're trapped in this particular reality, and we feel powerless to change, to break the habit of being ourselves. These excessive survival emotions tip the scales of a healthy ego, the self we consciously refer to when we say I. When the ego is in check, its natural job is to make sure we are protected and safe in the outer world. As an example, the ego makes sure we stay far away from a bonfire or a few steps away from the cliff's edge. When the ego is balanced, its natural instinct is self-preservation. There's a healthy balance between its needs and those of others, its attention to itself and to others. When we're in survival mode in an emergency situation, it makes sense that the self should take priority. But when chronic, long-term stress chemicals push the body and brain out of balance, the ego becomes over-focused on survival and puts the self first to the exclusion of anything else. We're selfish all the time. Thus, we become self-indulgent, self-centered and self-important, full of self-pity and self-loathing. When the ego is under constant stress, it's got a me first priority. Under those circumstances, the ego is primarily concerned with predicting every outcome of every situation, because it is overly focused on the outer world and feels completely separated from the 99.99999% of reality. In fact, the more we define reality through our senses, the more this reality becomes our law. And material reality as law is the very opposite of the quantum law. Whatever we place our awareness on is our reality. Consequently, if our attention is focused on the body and our physical realm, and if we become locked into a particular line of linear time, then this becomes our reality. To forget about the people we know, the problems we have, the things we own, and the places we go. To lose track of time, to go beyond the body and its need to feed its habituations, to give up the high from emotionally familiar experiences that reaffirm the identity, to detach from trying to predict a future condition or review a past memory, to lay down the selfish ego that is only concerned with its needs, to think or dream greater than how we feel and crave the unknown. This is the beginning of freedom from our present lives. Let's go one step further. I explained earlier that we can turn on the stress response by thought alone. I also mentioned the scientific fact that the chemicals associated with stress pull the genetic trigger by creating a very harsh environment outside of ourselves, and thus creating disease. So, by pure reason, our thoughts can actually make us sick. If our thoughts can make us sick, might they also make us well? Let's say that a person has had some experiences within a short time frame that caused him to feel resentful. As a result of his unconscious reactions to those occurrences, he held on to his bitterness. Chemicals corresponding to this emotion flooded his cells. Over weeks, his emotion turned into a mood, which continued for months and changed into a temperament, which was sustained for years and formed a strong personality trait called resentment. In fact, he memorized this emotion so well that the body knew resentment better than the conscious mind, because he remained in a cycle of thinking and feeling and thinking that way for years. Based on what you learned about emotions as being the chemical signature of an experience, wouldn't you agree that as long as this person clings to resentment, his body will react as though it is still experiencing the long-ago events that first caused him to embrace this emotion? Moreover, if the body's reaction to those chemicals of resentment disrupted the functions of certain genes, and this sustained reaction kept signaling the same genes to respond in the same way, might the body eventually develop a physical condition, such as cancer? If so, is it possible that once he unmemorized the emotion of continuous resentment, by no longer thinking the thoughts that created the feelings of resentment, and vice versa, his body, as the unconscious mind, would be free from that emotional enslavement? In time, would he stop signaling the genes the same way? And finally, let's say he began thinking and feeling in new ways, to such a degree that he invented a new ideal for himself, related to a new personality. As he moved into a new state of being, might he signal his genes in beneficial ways and condition the body into an elevated emotional state ahead of the actual experience of good health? Could he do this to the extent that the body would begin to change by thought alone? What I just described in simple terms happened to a student in one of my seminars who overcame cancer. Bill, 57, was a roofing contractor. A lesion had appeared on his face, and a dermatologist diagnosed malignant melanoma. Although Bill underwent surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, the cancer recurred in his neck, then his side, and finally his calf. Each time he underwent a similar course of treatment. Naturally, Bill experienced why me moments. He understood that his excessive sun exposure was a risk factor, but he knew others who had been similarly exposed and didn't develop cancer. He fixated on that unfairness. After treatment for the same cancer on his left flank, Bill pondered whether his own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors had contributed to his condition. In a moment of self-reflection, he realized that for more than 30 years he had been stuck in resentment, thinking and feeling that he always had to give up what he wanted for the sake of others. For example, he had wanted to become a professional musician after high school, but when an injury left his father unable to work, Bill had to join his family's roofing company. He habitually re-experienced his feelings upon being told he had to give up his aspirations, to the extent that his body still lived in that past. This also set up a pattern of dreams deferred. Whenever something didn't go his way, such as the housing market collapsing just after he expanded the business, he always found someone or something to blame. Bill had so memorized the emotional response pattern of bitterness that it dominated his personality and became an unconscious program. His state of being had signaled the same genes for so long that they had created the disease that now afflicted him. No longer could Bill allow his environment to control him. The people, places, and influences in his life had always dictated how he thought, felt, and behaved. He sensed that to break the bonds with his old self and reinvent a new one, he would have to leave his familiar environment. So for 2 weeks in Baja, Mexico, he retreated from his familiar life. The first 5 mornings, Bill contemplated how he thought when he felt resentment. He became a quantum observer of his thoughts and feelings. He became conscious of his unconscious mind. Next, he paid attention to his previously unconscious behaviors and actions. He decided to halt any thought, behavior, or emotion that was unloving towards himself. After the first week of this vigilance, Bill felt free because he had liberated his body from its emotional addiction to resentment. By inhibiting the familiar thoughts and feelings that had driven his behaviors, in a sense, he impeded the signals of the survival emotions from conditioning his body to the same mind. His body then released energy, which was available to use to design a new destiny for himself. For the next week, Bill became so uplifted that he thought about the new self he wanted to be and how he would respond to the people, places, and influences that previously controlled him. For instance, he decided that whenever his wife and kids expressed a wish or need, he would respond with kindness and generosity instead of making them feel like a burden. In short, he focused on how he wanted to think, act, and feel when presented with situations that had challenged him in the past. He was creating a new personality, a new mind, and a new state of being. Bill began to put into practice what he placed in his mind while sitting on that Baja beach. Shortly after his return, he noticed that the tumor on his calf had fallen off. In a week or so, when he went to his doctor, he was cancer-free. He has remained that way. By firing his brain in new ways, Bill changed biologically and chemically from his previous self. As a result, he signaled new genes in new ways, and those cancer cells couldn't coexist with his new mind, new internal chemistry, and new self. Once trapped by the emotions of the past, he now lives in a new future. At the end of the previous chapter, I briefly described what it is like to live in creative mode. Those are the moments of being fully engaged and in flow, so that the environment the body and time all seem immaterial and don't invade our conscious thoughts. Living in creation is living as a nobody. Ever notice that when you're truly in the midst of creating anything, you forget about yourself? You disassociate from your known world. You are no longer a somebody who associates your identity with certain things you own, particular people you know, certain tasks you do, and different places you lived at specific times. You could say that when you are in a creative state, you forget about the habit of being you. You lay down your selfish ego and become selfless. You have moved beyond space and time and become pure, immaterial awareness. Once you're no longer connected to a body, no longer focused on people, places, or things in your external environment, and beyond linear time, you're entering the door of the quantum field. You cannot enter as a somebody. You must do so as a nobody. You have to leave the self-centered ego at the door and enter the realm of consciousness as pure consciousness. And as I said in chapter 1, in order to change your body to foster better health, something in your external circumstances, a new job or relationship perhaps, or your timeline toward a possible future reality, you have to become nobody, no thing, no time. Thus here is the grand hint. To change any aspect of your life, body, environment, or time, you must transcend it. You must leave behind the big three in order to control the big three. When we are in creation, we are activating the brain's creative center, the frontal lobe, part of the forebrain and comprising the prefrontal cortex.